Well, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. We're looking forward for another great session. If ever I can guarantee a sellout of a session, it's when we have Neil Usher as a speaker. So you have a very demanding audience today, Neil. So I look forward to hearing from you. Neil is an author, and his latest book, The Elemental Change, is going to be featured in his talk now. But as you may be aware, I have purchased copies, and I have 20 that I will give away randomly to any of those that have attended. And it will be a random draw, and Neil will choose the numbers out of an Excel spreadsheet hat. So we look forward to that. Just to let you know, we will use the chat box for questions. And if you could turn your videos off, that would be really helpful. Neil, it's over to you. Thank you very much. We're looking forward to a great session. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Good morning or good evening, everyone. It's fantastic to see so many people from around the world calling in. And I've been sitting here watching the names appearing, and I know a fair few of you. Which is always a little more disconcerting. It's always slightly less daunting talking to strangers, but it's great to be talking to you this morning. First one of 2021. While I'd love to be sitting here talking to you about American politics, I think we need to get onto the business of the talk this morning. This is me. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Chief Workplace and Change Strategist at GoSpace AI. I'm very happy to talk to you about that afterwards, but it's not necessarily intelligent space allocation isn't necessarily the theme of the morning, but the whole sort of, in this world of rapid change that we live in, obviously sort of managing and leading change is going to be our primary focus. And as the title of the talk suggests, from the workplace to change, it's elemental. And there's my very subtle color shift to a slightly different palette. Just to say, those of you who may recall, and I've probably spoken to a number of you about it over time. I wrote my first book, was published in 2018, but I started thinking about it in 2016, really because I was getting a little frustrated at how tough it was for, in particular, sort of new entrants to the workplace field to find, something sort of that brought everything together, really, all of the strands, all of the threads together, that was structured, that was accessible, and it wasn't a sort of travelogue or a picture book. Because as we know, with workplace books that feature lots of lovely photos of workplaces, within a year or two, they're often out of date and thinking and practice has moved on. So I wanted to create something that was a little more structured and might stand the test of time. Probably not as much of the test of time that Robert Propst's book has stood, but at least a little longer than a couple of years. And so I moved from a couple of blog posts in sitting in monastic silence for about 6 weeks into a book, and amidst a lot of swearing and cursing and waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning with another idea, the Elemental Workplace was born. But within the Elemental Workplace, there are only about 10 pages on leading change, and a number of people suggested to me that it really resonated. And while I was going through the sort of machinations of thinking about sort of expanding on the Elemental Workplace or writing something more about workplace, it dawned on me that what I'd actually been doing for the whole of my career, and when I look at the sort of pre-workplace and the property and workplace parts of that career, it spans nearly 40 years, I'm afraid to say. But actually what I'd been doing for the vast majority of that time was leading change of one form or another. And so I decided to take on the challenge of writing about change. Hence, its sort of twin publication, Elemental Change, came out in the UK back in November last year and comes out in the US in February. And probably took about 2 years, really. But it's sort of something that really I stressed when I was talking about the workplace with the first book, was that we're all leaders of change first and foremost. We often think in workplace terms that we will do a little bit of change work as a plug-in somewhere downstream. The process of conceiving of a workplace, of designing it, of thinking about the sort of practices and the opportunities that we want to create was somehow different from the process of leading the change itself, and that by then deploying change specialists at some point, 3/4, 4/5 of the way through the project, we would actually then make sure that our ideas were understood and taken up when people moved into this new workplace. But realistically, that's not the way it works. The way it works is that change begins before we think it begins, and it ends long after we think it's ended. If it ends at all, it more sort of spreads into a delta and becomes other change. And so consequently, I'd just like to just reiterate really that we are all leaders of change first and foremost in everything we do. And so therefore, an understanding in some form or structured way of what change is, how we lead it, and what we have to do to lead change is incredibly important. But I have to also stress that it's not a workplace book per se. While it's able to be applied within the workplace sector, this applies to leading change anywhere, and that could just be something that you're doing at home. Those of you remember the series Kung Fu, they always said, don't try this at home, but with elemental change, I would suggest that you actually do try it at home. And there are three sort of underlying principles to the book, in a similar way that there were three underlying principles to the elemental workplace, which is that we should be able to deploy this framework anywhere, in any sector, any culture, any industry. There are a number of you from around the world who've dialed in today, and I would be confident that this approach in its local context would be applicable. So I've tried to create something that is entirely ubiquitous. Second of all, we have to be able to understand it. Sort of talking, writing, thinking about change shouldn't be an exercise in sort of navel gazing. It should be something that we can actually sort of immediately understand. A lot of the change materials that I researched whilst before and whilst writing the book felt a little bit like sort of a flat pack wardrobe almost, which is we see the picture and we know what the success will supposedly look like, but we still can't fathom how we actually get there, and a lot of the bits seem to be missing. So I needed to make sure that this was something that anyone anywhere could actually understand immediately, and then thereafter use it. It has to be something practical. And I'm confident as well that it could be usable before you've even finished it. It doesn't have to be something that you have to understand in total. Hopefully it's understandable enough to be able to use it as you're going along. And all of this starts from a very simple premise, because I would spend a lot of time thinking about, well, how is change different either side of the sort of corporate revolving door? And I appreciate that at the moment that revolving door isn't doing a lot of revolving. It's a little more metaphorical than it is real, but essentially, change is exactly the same anywhere in our life, which is incredibly messy. And getting anything done, I liken it sort of, if you've ever been to California trying to get across one of their freeways, blindfolded and carrying a tray of drinks, it's really incredibly difficult, and everything is constantly moving. You can't really see a lot of what's moving, but you're just aware that it is, and you're aware that potentially it can completely kibosh what you're trying to do. Also, in all of that sort of context, we're inherently conflicted. We're always involved in the process that we're trying to lead. We don't sit outside of that process. We're not observing it through binoculars from a hillside. We're very much on the streets, involved. We're necessarily conflicted in everything we do, which can make it frustrating, it can make it annoying and unpredictable. But also, as I reiterate with creating a workplace, leading change should actually be fun to as great a degree as possible. And so we also must bear in mind that in leading change, we don't have an opt-out. We are inherently conflicted, we're involved, it's messy, but that's something we've been dealing with through all of our lives. It's not something that's entirely new when we go through that corporate revolving door. But I would like to take a moment just to acknowledge the contribution in this book from two people. The first one, a number of you probably heard me talking about Heraclitus before, writing in Ephesus in the 6th century BC. I'm always fascinated by the incredible degree of sophistication and thought from ancient Greece, when we think about their world, it was just so much less complicated than the world we face today. But the ability to think and to write about issues that we're constantly grappling with today was absolutely extraordinary. And Heraclitus gave us a couple of notions of change that I think are absolutely vital. And one is that change is literally everything, all is flux. And in that sense, he also, and there's a sort of simplified version of what he said, which is that you never step twice in the same river. That the river has moved on, and so have you. and it's changed you at the same time. So this notion that everything is constantly in a state of flux ties neatly back to the notion that we are first and foremost leaders of change, and then we're specialists in our chosen field as a sort of secondary consideration. And on the right-hand side, it may be a UK thing, it may be an age thing, but some of you may recognise Professor Piehead from the satirical Viz comic, more an adult comic than a children's comic. But I think Professor Piehead was probably one of my more sort of recent change heroes, if you like, because I think he recognised three things. One of those was the sort of human and the emotional aspects of change. You know, he very much felt this at a human level and was emotionally incredibly attached to the changes that he was trying to create. He always blew himself up on his lab assistant, but he kept coming back. He had this indomitable spirit. Nothing was actually going to knock him off course, and whatever he tried, and following the sort of the blowing the two of them up, he would still bounce back and he would still keep going and he would still try new things. Because he was recognizing the third thing here, which is that change succeeds by degree. It invariably succeeds partially. It's a partial success. And at the end of every cartoon strip, he would say, you know, another partial success. That is, when we think about the change initiatives that we've led, is a fundamental characteristic of those initiatives. There's a really, you know, awful myth that persists within change circles, and a number of books and articles have been written on the back of it, which is that 70% of all change initiatives fail. An author recently decided to, he's actually an interesting chap because he's an ex-police detective, so obviously his research was quite forensic, but he went back through all of the texts and he realized that nobody had ever attached any evidence to this. That was one of those phrases, and I think we get a lot of it in the workplace field, where people just continually repeat it. It comes from somewhere, it gets repeated, and it gets quoted from the last time that it was written. But the source, the original source, remains elusive. And there is no original source for that claim, and his conclusion was that it was probably closer to 6%. So the next time that you quote it or read it or say, look, you know, 70% of all change initiatives fail, there's absolutely no basis for that whatsoever. We're a lot more successful to a huge degree than we ever give ourselves credit for. So leading change isn't something to be daunted by either. So using the contribution of those two chaps and a number of other people during the course of the book, I've created a model for leading change that exists on 3 levels. And I'm going to deal with it from the base upwards. Logically, we usually work top down, but in this instance, we're working sort of bottom upwards here. And I will spend the rest of this talk looking at each of these three levels of leading change. The first really is some reflection on the infrastructure of change, why we're doing this. Just a little bit of thinking about what change is and what change means, and I've touched on some of that already. The second is how we actually prepare for change, very distinct from planning for it, as I will come on and illustrate. And there are 6 components of what I've created as the change operating system, which ensures that we are always prepared for change, particularly when there are high levels of uncertainty. And then the action. You'd be pleased to know there's a periodic table returned because it's an incredibly useful way of presenting information. It's the stuff we do, and very often the entry point for a lot of workplace change initiatives is just to sort of get on and do stuff and forget to reflect on what changes and what it's all about, and almost forgetting to prepare a lot of the time. We just sort of weigh in. So we're going to go through each of these 3 in turn. So the why, the reflection. Why are we actually doing this? But just before I mention some of these aspects of the why, this is one of those sort of really annoying models that I sketched out on a bit of paper one day, and then I realised that someone had actually thought of this long before I had. So I can't claim any credit for this whatsoever. But what I can say is that it's an incredibly useful tool for sense making. It was actually sketched out previously by a chap called Dave Snowden, who used to be at IBM. He gave us a framework called the Cynefin framework, if you've ever come across it, as a sense making tool. The Cynefin framework was used during 9/11, and it's also, I believe, been used, and some of those from the government circles who are on this call may well know better than I do, but I believe it has been used in some of the COVID planning as well. But This is actually an earlier iteration. Dave Snowden wrote a really fantastic paper, it's about 25 pages long. If you're ever interested, I can send you the link on how the Cynefin framework came into being. But I think this particular four-pane model is much more useful for us, much more accessible for us on a day-to-day basis than potentially the Cynefin framework, which looks at sort of four scenarios really, and it helps us to take everything we know. And if you think about the sort of situation you're facing now with the workplace, and I've done this on another presentation where I've been more forensic with this and pulled it apart in terms of the responses we make from the information and the knowledge that we have in front of us. Because actually we have a tendency to lump everything together and just try and make sense of everything that's in front of us. But actually, if we start to look at what we know, we can make a plan. We can actually be quite linear in our thinking because we have a reasonable expectation of things happening. When we start to realize that there's some things that we don't know, there's some eventualities, we start to have more of a tree ahead of us in terms of some branches and some ways that we might think about this. So we plan, but we've got some options. They might link, but we have a sort of a number of ways that this may go. When we're into things we don't know, it's just a question mark, potentially even an exclamation mark. This is completely unknown territory. So we can't make a plan when we have no idea what we don't know. So we have to be prepared. This is why, as I'll come on to, the operating system of change is absolutely vital, because preparation is a far more important idea than planning, as I will explain. But the last pane in the bottom right I find fascinating. This is the unknown knowns. And it was a philosopher, Zizek, who later sort of articulated, I think better than Dave Snowden, articulated what this pain really means. These are the things we suppress. These are things we know, we actually know we know, but we don't want to admit it. We don't want to own up. These are the things we actually have to face up to. Sometimes they're unpalatable, they're unpleasant, they're sort of things that we just really ought to know better about, but we just think, I don't really want to have to deal with that right now. And if we think in workplace terms about where we were at with well-being before the pandemic and the first lockdown came, the sort of issues that we were dealing with, we've sort of buried those really. What we've actually been dealing with now is the two issues really of sort of isolation, social isolation, and what that means, and means with our colleagues, and means on a personal level, and also the sort of excessive number of hours that we spend in sort of two-dimensional communication like this, and the sort of fatigue that's associated with some of these tools and practices. But actually, when we say, gosh, we can't wait to get back to the office because it's going to be fantastic when we're all back in the office, we still have friends, still have colleagues, well, all those previous well-being issues that we were dealing with they haven't miraculously gone away because we've not been in the office. They're still there, and they will return, and we have to face up to those. So I recommend this tool to you in any issues you're facing, any complex change that you're facing. This is an incredibly useful tool to use. I've actually been using it for a few things that I'm dealing with personally at home, because I've found it an incredibly useful way of actually navigating my way through what's ahead. So let's look at the three layers of sort of understanding change, really. And the first of these, I think, sort of occurs at a sort of universal level. These are the things, like I intimated in relation to the thinking of Heraclitus, these are the things that are true regardless. These are things we can't change. They are, by virtue of existing, they are there. And some of the implications of this, really, in terms of thinking about sort of literally everything being changed and change being our essence, is that we are in a constant state of evolution. Very often we talk about transformational change. Somehow a change we're leading doesn't have any kind of credibility or status unless it's a transformation. But in biological terms, a transformation is actually a very small event. It is where a single cell consumes another single cell, the vast majority of times it being entirely fatal. And goes nowhere, but on the odd occasion, something interesting happens and it becomes something else. So actually, when we're thinking about change at a sort of universal level, what we're actually thinking about is evolution, is the fact that there is a constant state of change in which occasionally interesting but small things happen. I'm actually all for elevating the idea of evolution and somehow downplaying the idea of transformation. But what you'll have seen during lockdown is a lot of books being published, and they're very sort of, chest thumping, table banging books about transformational change. Well, actually, a lot of the most important and the most interesting change that occurs isn't necessarily transformational, it's evolutionary, which means there's a huge difference between adaptation and adoption. Adoption is more of a sort of stick-on exercise. Actually, when we lead workplace change initiatives, we often sort of try to stick on new protocols and new behaviours, but most of the time they fall off or they're rejected. Whereas actually, to play to the way that evolution works and the way that change unfolds, we have to have a strategy that's much more based on adaptation, which means it takes a little time. You can't put time limits or impose time limits on these sorts of things. And the last idea here, really, which I've touched on in Elemental Workplace before, is the idea of perpetual beta, which is another one of these ideas we borrow from the software sector, which has been a really handy source of inspiration and information for us in workplace, which is the idea that we're all actually co-designers of something that is constantly evolving. We have a feedback loop. We are constantly listening to those people who occupy that workspace, and we are constantly tweaking and changing that workplace to meet ever-changing needs. These aren't necessarily one-off events that occur every 5 or 10 years. And we have some more global world-level views, really, like our worldview, which is a product of our culture, our environment, our education, all of the influences we have, the way we see the world, and the world we're sort of operating in. And every one of us on this call will have a very different worldview. We will approach any single issue that we encounter with the benefit of all of the influences that have taken place in our life, and we will see it very differently. So when we're leading a change initiative, we will be seeing the world in a particular way, and so will all of the people who are subject to our change initiative. And that's incredibly difficult for us to be objective and to understand what the constraints of our worldview may be, and then also to try and understand the way that others are seeing the world. But also there's something else in the global sphere as well, which is understanding how our brains work and understanding that a lot of the small but highly significant and influential parts of our brain really date from the Stone Age. Mankind in present form has been on the planet for around about 300,000 years. So if we actually look at the proportion of time in which we've made the rapid progress, really, it's a tiny proportion of that. It's really only about 3,000 years in which we've actually made a lot of the progress that we see today. And yet our brains evolved over a much, much longer period of time. And these little bits of our brain that keep behaving in ways that we can't necessarily control are still governing a lot of what happens in change. And then we have more local issues, the context and our values being two. And there's a really interesting play between context, which is the things we can and can't do by virtue of where we are and the environment we're in, and our values, which is what we will and we won't do. So if we actually put those together in another four blocker, we actually start to see that there's only a certain area in which, when leading change, we can operate quite freely, which are the things that people will do and the things that people can do. So the exercise for us, by understanding context and values, is to move ourselves and move our initiative into that area where people will be able to do things and will be prepared to do things as well. And it's at this stage of the book that I do start to look at the resistance to change in the form of inertia and complacency and outward resistance. But I don't dwell excessively on these ideas. I think we often dwell far too heavily on resistance, and we adopt the language of resistance mitigation in a change initiative, and that's an entirely wrong thing to do. Because we're focused on resistance, then everything we encounter will look like resistance. It's a much more positive and opportunity-oriented approach to change that I'm taking here. So we're kitted out, we've got our foundation in change, and now we have to think about preparing. How we're actually going to do this. And what I've created here, this operating system of change, are what I believe are 6 key things that we need to include in our preparation. And I've shown them on this spider chart. It has some resonance with the 6 E's of a fantastic workplace. But I will just touch very briefly on each of these. So the opportunity, really, there's no natural starting point, but I think opportunity, if there is going to be a starting point, it's here. Because once we have started this process, we are into an evolution. And so therefore, all of these things don't just get dealt with once. We have to we have to prepare ourselves and remain prepared throughout. This isn't just a sort of a one-off exercise, but with the opportunity, we can see what's possible. I've never seen in any of the change initiatives I've been involved in all this time an opportunity map. But I think it's absolutely vital to understand where we've come from, where we are now, and where we need to get to. I think one of the interesting things in the digital age really is that if I remember sort of teaching myself facilities management way back in 1992, I did that using a whole series of binders that were stored in an office, and I looked through each and every one of those. How many of you have taken on a new role and been presented with a digital record of your predecessor's activity and a clear audit trail of why everything is the way it is? We just don't do that. We don't go back through that. Most of the knowledge within an organisation walks out the door when people leave. And we're looking at the vision, and vision statements are great, but I actually think they're missing a trick. And I think that we can inspire the possible by asking a question, not making a statement. So I'm suggesting that the vision statement becomes a vision question, because a question actually hijacks the brain. You can't help it. If someone asks you a question, whether you want to or not, you will be thinking about a possible answer to that. It might be a very quick process, it might be a long process, but the more engaging the question, the more time and effort you're going to put into thinking about it. And for everyone that's involved in that change initiative with us, they'll actually feel like they're part of it. They'll feel like they're included. So we can start the process really early of actually engaging and including people in that process. We then need evidence, and I look at both data and story. And data is fine on its own, but it needs a story to be told around it. And a story is great, but it needs some data to support it. So we're actually looking for proof points. We're actually looking for the materiality, if you like, of our change operating system, and that inevitably involves leadership. We can't talk about change with leading change without talking about leadership as an idea, as a practice. Because we have to deliver that change, and I've offered some guidance in there in terms of what I think makes good change leadership or not. And again, it's very straightforward. Trust is an absolutely vital issue. We've had a lot of conversation about trust really since lockdown, because suddenly when we're not in this sort of synchronous work mode, or many of us are not in the synchronous work mode in one another's presence, where we can almost sort of watch trust unfolding before us. Trust has become quite a hot topic. But somehow we have to secure what's possible, and trust enables us to do that. There is an idea that's sort of out there at the moment, talked about a lot, and it's almost 40 years old. And the idea is psychological safety. Now, to my thinking, if an idea has been around for 40 years and we still can't explain it properly, then somewhere along the line we're going wrong. Because if an idea has been out there for 40 years, it's either been proven or not, but it makes a massive contribution in the workplace. Psychological safety being a space in which is ripe for safe conflict, where we can express ourselves in ways that mean we're not going to be judged, we're not going to be prejudiced in any way at all. But I actually think it's missing a significant component, which is physical safety, which is often talked about in an entirely different context to psychological safety. But actually, initiatives like the Me Too movement really brought physical safety into our world, as did the pandemic. With a lot of people outside of facilities management had no idea what PPE stood for before February last year. But we all now know what personal protective equipment is and what it means, what it does, and why it's important. A third example is I've worked several times in very remote communities where I'm carrying a sort of corporate message, or I'm running a workplace or a property initiative in a location where just about everybody of working age works for the same company. And that's embedded in the community, where the ways that organisation and community works are very different. So you do start to feel a little bit physically uncomfortable when you are trying to make something happen in a location where a lot of people don't want you to, or aren't comfortable with that. So physical safety has to be part of this. So I've rechristened psychological safety elemental safety, because I think it brings in the rational, the sort of taking a safe position in terms of what we think, the emotional in terms of the expressions, and that can be verbal or non-verbal expression, and physical safety as part of trust. And the final one here are resources. And the resources I'm looking at is almost endless, but this is how we actually make it possible. So we're looking at the people we need, the money we need, This is where the plan comes in. I talked about the difference between preparation and planning. This is why preparation is at such a higher level than a plan. A plan is a soft, flexible device that is one of the resources we bring to bear when we consider that forepain in terms of making sense of the changed sort of challenges ahead of us. And we try and maneuver as much as possible into the pain where we know what we know and we can confidently and safely plan. But preparation is much more important than planning. So taking each of these on board, we can now look at what we're actually going to do. And we can look at the actions that we would need to take in leading change. So I promised you a periodic table. It's more of a square, and the reason it is in this format is because the groups, which are the vertical columns, actually mean quite a lot in this instance. So the first group, sort of 1, 2, and 3, are all about being informed. I'm informed. I mentioned this in the Elemental Workplace. This is a significant expansion of this to explain what that actually really means in practical terms. The second column, 4, 5, 6, is about being engaged. It's the emotional connection. I emotionally feel something that's happening. And the last of these, 7, 8, and 9, is about being involved. It's the sort of the physical involvement that we will have. Now, I'm constantly asked with sort of the Elemental Workplace, okay, so there's 12 elements. What are the 3 most important? Or, everyone's always looking to sort of to reduce it still further. In the same way here, each one of these 9 elements will be present in leading your change initiative to some degree or other. Very often, a lot of change initiatives, like the one I described at the beginning of the talk, where we are sort of unduly focused on sort of looking at change as a downstream plug-in, usually end after 1, 2, and 3 here in terms of just purely and simply it being something to do with communication. Sometimes they end with communication and a bit of engagement, forget about involvement. The most effective and successful change initiatives to be led will involve all 9 of these elements in some degree or other, some given context and values dialed up, some dialed down, all in relation to our understanding of change and then the operating system as well. So I'll have a look at each group very, very briefly. In terms of being informed, the lexicon and tone of voice that we take on are incredibly important. I've seen many change initiatives begin with people talking just like they used to talk. But if we ensure with our colleagues that they're seeing something different, they're hearing something different, they're hearing a different tone of voice, they're seeing different words being used, they will start to understand, irrespective of the actual nature of the change and the substance, they will start to understand that something is changing or about to change. We actually have a fantastic opportunity from the very first communication with people to prepare them for the changes to come. If we miss that opportunity, it actually takes a long, long time to recover it. Because if we've just issued a memo or an email in exactly the same way that sort of corporate communications worked in the past, nobody's really going to pay much attention. They're going to think it's the same stuff and it's not significant. Whereas presenting it, thinking about it in terms of how we say things, the words we use, is absolutely vital from the very word go. And then in terms of the message, it's really important to understand why we're saying what we're saying, how we're saying it, and then the content and what we actually say. Now, probably the most important aspect of this, particularly when we relate it to what's going on with COVID, and certainly in the UK we've experienced this, is that clarity is a really difficult thing to attain. And if we are not clear, then our change initiative will struggle regardless. And however clear we're being, we're probably not being clear enough. Now, I'm doing my level best today to describe this book and the ideas within it in as clear a way as possible. And I look at my materials and I think, yeah, I understand that. Well, of course I understand it. It's my book, it's my ideas. This is something that I've been living and breathing for the last 2 years. So, we're the easiest people to convince if we're leading a change initiative. Of course we understand it's a good idea. Of course we think it's a great project. And of course, when we tell people, they're going to understand exactly what we mean at the outset. Well, they're probably not going to. So clarity in all of this is absolutely vital. And sometimes to that degree, a repetition. But most of the time with communication, we're actually looking for a response. We're looking for something back. We have to be incredibly good listeners as well as being incredibly good communicators or deliverers of a message. And a lot of the time listening, and if most of the environments you're in, listening feels a little bit like lip service or a sort of token effort. But if we're to create that perpetual beta loop, if we're going to actually have that feedback meaning something in our initiative and actually being, sort of a critical part of the co-design of our solution, then we have to be able to listen and we have to be able to respond. So engagement is where we get people starting to feel something. Some of that starts with the structures we create, from governance to the change champions, and also to the creative stock that we use. I've lost count of the numbers of sort of workplace change initiatives that forget that creative stock is an incredibly important part of this, because just as we want with lexicon and tone of voice things to appear different in the way we're speaking to people, we want it to appear different in the way we're actually presenting this as well. If it actually looks and feels different in terms of the creative materials we're using and the approach we're taking, then we're really impressing upon people that something here is different. Then we look at the examples we set. Now that's not just, it's incredibly important for leaders to set the best possible example. And it's probably one of the only ways that we actually influence behavior. But example comes through at every single level of a business. It's not something where when we're leading a change initiative, we just look at a few people as being those who sort of live and breathe. It's the change initiative is absolutely everyone. And we need to make sure that example is something that is infused through the whole change initiative. And then in terms of exploration, this is something particularly relevant to workplace change initiatives, because this is where we have the opportunity to experiment and to create pilots of what we're actually trying to deliver. There is a big difference between an experiment and a pilot. An experiment is much more open-ended. We're going to learn a lot more from what we're doing. A pilot is usually fine-tuning. We've made most of the decisions, or most of the decisions have been collectively made, and we're just looking for that last few percent to just sort of iron it out and to show people what we've all collectively decided. Very often experiments and pilots get a little mixed up. I also look at the idea here of what's called Trojan mice, which I think is a fascinating concept, which is rather than sort of waiting for the huge pilot that we build at the end of the process, we can actually look at some what are also otherwise called safe to fail probes, things that we can do which are, and not to be confused with quick wins, which actually I think are one of the problems we face in change initiatives. And I explore in the book why I don't think quick wins are necessarily a good idea. But Trojan mice, which are things that we don't mind failing because we will actually learn from, but we can set some of these Trojan mice free. Rather than waiting to build the huge horse with the whole army inside it, let's look at some ideas that we can set running and that we can actually have going on in background while we're doing other things. So Trojan mice. And the last of the groups is involvement. Now, I was really sort of thinking about the sort of fields that are successful in terms of involvement and where that learning should really come through. And I looked at social activism quite extensively in thinking about involvement in change initiatives, and the work of one lady in particular, Lisa Fithian. And it was fascinating, really, because actually when we look at involvement, it's a very small percentage of a population with social activity that actually needs to be involved to actually make a huge difference. We're looking for a bit more than that, and usually in most of our change initiatives. We want as many people involved as possible, but there are 3 levels of involvement. The first of those is people just showing up, being present, being there, as Peter Sellers would have said it. The second of these is activity, where we're actually getting people to do something. Now that might be a formal role that we've assigned them. They might be a change champion. They might have some sort of duty that they've been given. We still have to manage those people. We can't, when we get people involved, we do need to, it's not just a reason for people to skip some of the day job and get involved in something else that's a bit more interesting, but because we do actually have to make sure they're doing what we need them to do. And then we have the last of the areas of involvement, which is people showing initiative. Well, we haven't actually asked people to do anything at all. They're just seeing what's going on with our change initiative and thinking, actually, you know what, this is fantastic. I really want to be part of this. I'm going to do something that is beneficial. Now, you might have got the hint in all of that actually we have to control that. While we have to manage the activity, we have to control initiative, because we don't want a whole host of people running off doing things we don't want them to do at the same time. So balance is key in all of this, and the idea of balance is just as important, just as relevant in leading a change initiative as it ever was in creating a fantastic workplace. And balance was something I really stressed in the Elemental workplace. But with initiative, I'm still talking about an idea that I guess, a little frustrating that it hasn't landed as well as it might have done. But it's the idea of tunneling. If you've heard me talk about this before or seen one of the videos I made on YouTube some time ago, it's people doing things differently and talking about doing things differently. It's usually quite low level activity, but it's the sort of living, the breathing, the change that we're actually instigating and leading. Could be said that the idea of working out loud, if you've heard that idea before, there are whole sort of working out loud communities is a sort of form of tunneling. But tunnelers are amongst us. They're not necessarily people that we give a role to. We don't say, you've been appointed as a tunneler. What we're actually doing is we're just trying to engage people sufficiently, get them involved sufficiently such that they actually start to behave in different ways. And with the workplace initiative, if we're not taking an adoption-oriented approach, we're taking an adaptation-based approach, because it will take some time for those change behaviours to bed in, for people to evolve into those new behaviours rather than be told to do them, or it being sort of stuck on, if you like. The role of the tunneler is incredibly important, because those people's journey will be much enhanced, and it will be hugely beneficial to them in making those changes if they hear other people talking about themselves doing things differently. It's an incredibly vital role. So, as I stressed before, in terms of the what, effectively, the action we take, each one of these is incredibly important in our change initiative to some degree or another. But it's a very useful toolkit. I've got a huge expansion of this in terms of putting change plans together, which I've tried and I've tested and I've used on a number of occasions. But they're all important, and it depends on the initiative, the degree of importance. But they all support all of the reflection we did in the first part of the book, the preparation we did in the second part. A lot of these wouldn't be possible without the first two. These wouldn't be possible on a successful basis without thinking through change and being prepared for it in the first instance. So just a quick reminder of the structure of the model. The reflection, the three levels of infrastructure of change, the infrastructure sitting at the bottom there that makes all of this possible. And the infrastructure being something we can't necessarily change ourselves. It's something that is that is existing and evolving in itself. The operating system of change in being prepared, and then the elements, the 9 elements of change, the actions we will take in leading a change initiative. So I'm rather hopeful that this will survive in the same way, hopefully, that the Elemental workplace will survive. I'd be delighted if any of you in time, and I appreciate this will also take some time to bed in for people to understand, but if any of you use this model in the future or use this approach in the future, it'd be fantastic to continue that conversation with you and to understand what you've encountered and how you found it. But I offer this to you as an approach that I believe will work, and I'm rather hoping that some of you will use it, because let's not forget, at the end of the day, we are all primarily, first and foremost, leaders of change. Thank you very much indeed.
Neil, thank you very much again for an excellent session. So we have a few questions for you. Do feel free to stop sharing your slides so that we can have your full face on the screen. That would be really good. I've put your email address in the chat box if you're okay with that, so people can contact you. So one of the questions is where does training fit in with the 9 elements of change?
It depends what you mean by training, in the sense of the process of communication. I mean, it's difficult to sometimes separate training from learning, and that sort of developmental process. But through the process of communicating, through the process of engaging people and getting them involved, effectively training spans all of those elements. The organisation of specific specific training classes or programs is something that will involve all of those 9 elements. They will all be instrumental in pulling all of those together. So I haven't identified training as a specific thing. It's because some change initiatives don't require training. Some are quite sort of, they're just intuitive. If you think about most of the new software you use, if you remember 20 years ago, anytime an organization rolled out a new software application, everybody had to go through, rounds and rounds of training. These days, you just get given a link or a download, and you find your way around because in some instances, we've become much more adept at designing sort of systems and applications for them to be intuitive, and we've become a lot more used to finding our own way at the same time. So it all depends on that context and the needs.
Thank you. Another question. For resistance to change, what are the key factors you use to motivate and engage people with the process?
Well, first and foremost, I don't think there's necessarily, there will be occasions where resistance is organised or a specific objection to a change initiative, but we can offset that by being prepared and the actions we take. So, I've offered this approach to change based on the fact that actually sometimes we should bear in mind the fact that resistance is incredibly important to us. Because very often people who are resisting care enough to actually resist. They actually have something to say. They have a perspective to offer. They understand potentially sometimes that we might not have thought things through properly. Because as I said during the talk, we're the easiest people to convince that the change is a good idea. But actually, sometimes we forget that we might not be very good at explaining to others why it's a good idea. So I think it's important to understand the nature of resistance, because resistance itself, which is active and specific, is very different from inertia, and it's very different from complacency. There'll always be a degree of inertia in a change initiative just because of the time taken. But we shouldn't look at resistance as something we have to squash or crush or move out of a change process. We actually have to listen to the resistors. It's an incredibly important resource. So I think the whole approach to resistance is different from seeing it as something that we need to counter and we need to combat.
Thank you. There's an observation that a lot of this seems to overlap with program management. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I just consider program management to be multiple projects, project being the singular and program being the multiple. But I do understand that some people look at it the other way around. But managing a program is just managing multiple initiatives occurring at the same time. Potentially for an overall objective, but there will be multiple streams. So whether it's a program or a project, I think the same approach applies.
Well, it looks like, Neil, that's the questions all answered, unless anyone has any more. I just wanted to say a great big thank you, as ever, for your great presentation. We will follow this up with some links, and also the link so that you can purchase the book. And we'll let you know very soon whether you are one of the 20 winners, because if you're not one of the 20 winners, then you need to buy Neil's book, obviously. So thank you very much. I've also posted a link in the chat box, which gives you a lot of other webinars that you can join. We have one next week on education spaces, but we have some a real mixture of speakers lined up, and most of them are external. Neil, thank you very much, and thank you everyone else for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day. Do stay, Neil, because lots of thank yous in the chat box.
Thank you very much indeed, everyone. It's really delighted you're here, and be delighted to keep talking. So if you do get a chance to read the book, if you disagree, if you think I've said the wrong thing or got my wires crossed or something, be delighted to hear from you. As I say at the outset, this is a work in progress. This book in itself is a perpetual beta, and like any operating system, it's open source. So let's keep the discussion going. But thank you very much indeed.